Hello, everyone, and happy World Environmental Day. I warmly welcome you to this online roundtable on forests as pillars of social and economic resilience, organized by the Science Policy Program of IUFRO, the International Union of Forest Research Organizations. My name is Nelson Grima, and I am the coordinator of IUFRO's Science Policy Program. For those of you who don't know IUFRO is the global network for forest science collaboration that connects over 600 member organizations that represent about 15,000 scientists related to forest sciences. IUFRO-SciPol provides a mechanism for effectively mobilizing scientific expertise and information to equip governments and intergovernmental processes with solid knowledge for making decisions that affect forests, trees, and land use regionally and globally. Before we go into the program of this event, I will briefly share some technical information. This meeting is being recorded and it will be available on our IUFRO YouTube channel after the session. Please use the Q&A box to ask questions to the speakers. Today, we will present and discuss the findings of our most recent assessment, which we are publishing with the title of Forest as Pillars for Social and Economic Resilience. Unfortunately, our speaker, Andrea Aquino, the chief of the Environmental Advisory Board at the Brazilian Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, will not be able to join. As you can see on the slide, we will start with a welcome and introduction and immediately proceed with the presentation of key findings. Then we will have some remarks on the relevance of this assessment for the global forest agenda and some reflections from the field, which will be continued by a moderated Q&A session and ending with the closing remarks. This report presents the results of the 9th Global Scientific Assessment undertaken within the framework of the Global Forest Expert Panels Initiative, or GFEP for short, which is a IUFRO-led joint initiative of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests. The core of GFEP is to provide objective and independent scientific assessments of key issues of global concern. All GFEP assessments are prepared by internationally recognized scientists from different professional backgrounds and geographical contexts. The publications are presented to stakeholders across relevant international policy fora to support more coherent policies on the role of forest in addressing environmental, social, and economic challenges reflected in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Given the increasingly rapid, unpredictable, and unprecedented global changes linked to the triple planetary crisis of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss, fostering resilience has become a key policy issue. We will now hear a presentation of key findings of the assessment report by the chair of the assessment and by two of its coordinating lead authors. I am very pleased to briefly introduce these three speakers, the first of whom is Craig Allen. Craig Allen is the assessment chair and is a professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the US. He is a leading ecologist, and his research focuses on resilience theory, complex systems, and adaptive management in social ecological systems. He has authored influential works on resilience and sustainability, contributing to global understanding of how ecosystems respond to disturbance. Santiago Izquierdo Tort is associate researcher at the Institute of Economic Research at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. His research explores the interface between economic development, climate change mitigation, and biodiversity protection policies, with a focus on the effectiveness and equity of forest conservation instruments based on economic incentives. He is also co-holder of the UNESCO Chair on Socioeconomic Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystems. And Rachel Carmenta is Associate Professor in Climate Change and Global Development at the University of East Anglia in the UK. Her research focuses on the changing relationships between people and place in tropical forest landscapes, particularly as mediated by fire and environmental governance, with a strong focus on social equity and justice. She is founder and chair of the Forest, Fires and People Working Group of the Forest and Livelihoods Network, or FLARE for short. If you have any questions for our speakers, please use the QA box and we will address as many of them as possible towards the end of the talks. Craig, Santiago, and Rachel, the floor is yours.
Hello, I'm Craig Allen. It's my pleasure to be a presenter today, but this assessment is the result of the efforts of many, including 22 lead authors. Thank you for joining us today. I'm joining from a forested island in Lake Michigan, suffering a bit from the effects of forest fires, both in Canada and the US at the moment. A report consists of 7 chapters, as shown on this slide. A presentation will very briefly cover the breadth of this assessment. Can I get the next slide, please? Why force? Why resilience? Why now? We attempt to address these questions in our presentation. Organization of this report is largely, but very briefly, reflected in this presentation. It includes 5 core chapters focused on framing, relationships, governance, assessing resilience and response options, and identifies key messages and research gaps. I'm going to cover the first 2 chapters in effect, the introduction and framing, and key message number 1. If there's time, I will also present research gaps after Santiago and Rachel have also presented. Next slide, please. We are in a period of rapid change, one unlike any humanity has experienced previously. Although ecology has always competed with economics for the title of the dismal science, because the news we bring is usually bad, rapid change cannot be denied, much of it with potential to have deleterious effects. These changes include increases in global connectivity, meaning that changes can propagate across systems quickly, an increase in the scale of human effects, meaning that small changes can scale up quickly. For example, changes in beef production in the U.S. Great Plains affects deforestation in the Amazon. Planetary boundaries were proposed a decade and a half ago. Since that time, we've gone from exceeding 3 of the 9 boundaries to exceeding 6 of the 9. The Triple Planetary Crisis that Nelson referred to refers to the interrelated threats of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss, all of which have been accelerating, as has humanity's impact on the globe in general. We have redistributed species, overexploited natural resources, and degraded much of what remains. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of bright spots to be found, but we have a critical period to navigate in order to emerge from this period of turbulence towards what we hope will be a period of more peaceful coexistence with the natural world and, of course, with each other. Next slide. We've all no doubt witnessed change in our own cherished forests. Perhaps a favorite woodlot was lost to agriculture. In my case, the fields and forests I grew up with became houses and shopping malls, and those have since become high-rises. Human populations and demands are continuing to increase, increasing pressure on natural resources, often leading to overexploitation or degradation. Land use change is causing forest losses globally, especially increasing urban and ex-urban sprawl and agricultural expansion of both row crops and livestock. Non-native species are having enormous impacts, as in the picture on the slide, which shows the loss of pine trees to pine beetle infestation. Climate change is stressing many forests, forcing rain shifts and increasing droughts, among many other effects. Few of the stressors act alone, and coping with and mitigating these multiple interacting stressors is difficult. For example, climate change is helping exacerbate the effect of invasive insect pests by stressing trees, as shown here. Next slide, please. Why forests? Forests are affected by rapid change, and forests have benefits for humanity. Forests cover about 1/3 of the terrestrial surface of Earth and contain about 80% of our biodiversity, a huge part of our natural capital. Over half of humans live within a kilometer of a forest, creating a close and natural connection between humans and forests. Humans likely evolved in forests and woodlands, which has created a deep link between humanity and forests. Personally, for peace and reflection, I go to the forest. Benefits are both social and economic, include local benefits such as forest products and enhanced quality of life, internationally important trade, but forests also provide a number of local, critically important but less easily valued benefits such as livelihoods for indigenous people or regulation of global biogeochemical cycles. Forests also enhance the resilience of social and economic systems, which is to say they help humanity cope with, buffer, and recover from shocks, be they in the form of hurricanes or market collapses or other perturbations. Next slide. Why resilience? Resilience has come to have two primary interpretations. First, resilience allows systems to recover from stresses. In fact, this ability to recover following disturbance is the definition of resilience that most folks know. There's an important dynamic, and in fact, most disturbances can be recovered from. However, this definition of resilience requires assumptions that cannot be met, that the system of interest has a single equilibrium, that the recovery state is always desired, and the system is stationary. Social ecological resilience recognizes that these assumptions fail and that in some cases the disturbance cannot be recovered from, that a critical threshold can be exceeded beyond which a system fundamentally changes. An example of alternative states in forest systems can be found in many dry systems globally, where critical processes of fire mediate in part whether the system exists as a forest or as a grassland. When an alternative state of a system emerges, the new system is often less desirable to humanity. Emergence of alternative states is less common in situations where recovery is possible, but much more consequential. Here, then, resilience is a measure of the amount of disturbance a system can withstand before crossing a critical threshold, but includes aspects of both resistance and recovery. Next slide. Our first key message then is that understanding and enhancing the resilience of forest SES is key to ensure their sustainability. Because the emergence of alternative states is so consequential for humanity, it is generally in our interest to maintain systems that are in desirable states and to enhance their resilience. Recovering to a desired state is difficult and far more difficult than maintaining a healthy system and enhancing its resilience. Forests and social systems linked with them make up complex adaptive social ecological systems. They have evolved as a result of contingent processes over time that are impossible to duplicate. They provide billions of dollars of quantifiable benefits to humans and many more intangible benefits. We tend to think of them as highly resilient. They take a lot of abuse. The forest SES have their limits, and it's often unclear where those limits lie. Paul Ehrlich used the analogy of an airplane. An airplane is like an ecosystem, and the rivets are like the species in that system. You can lose one or two rivets, maybe dozens of rivets, but you don't know which rivet will end up being critical, with its removal leading to the crash of the airplane, or that is, the collapse of a forest system. Resilience theory has grown by leaps and bounds, but our knowledge is outpaced by the rate of global change. Therefore, we need to continue to foster our extant forests and work to better understand and enhance their resilience, including our management and our governance of them. Thank you. I'm handing over next to Santiago.
Thanks very much, Craig, and for laying out the scene, and thanks, Nelson, for that kind introduction. So from the beginning, our aim in this report was to conduct a global assessment of the current state of knowledge and scientific evidence concerning contributions of forests to social and economic resilience. But fairly quickly, when reviewing and starting to review viewing the evidence, it became really clear that from a resilience perspective, these contributions are rather complex and dynamic and multifaceted. So these relationships operate at several temporal spatial scales. They're not unidirectional in the sense that forests affect people, but also people affect forests. So these are reciprocal, and there are a bunch of feedback loops there. They're strongly shaped by different types of social and ecological attributes, and they're also influenced by different types of external shocks and conditions. So this is what we show in this framework that we developed, this complexity and multifaceted relationship between forests on the one hand and social and economic resilience on the other. We believe this new framework is useful in that it explicitly links forests to social and economic resilience, provides a very comprehensive structure to analyze these relationships, and allows us to facilitate the systematic review and comparison of different types of scientific evidence. And this is what we do in one of the chapters and throughout the report. Next slide, please. Or should I do it? All right. So this takes us to the key message 2. So forests provide key benefits for enhancing social and economic resilience globally and locally. Let me go back. Okay, so there's already a body of great knowledge on how forests provide goods and services that benefit people. So we have the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, IPBS, the recent Dasgupta report, really showing how forests contribute to society. What we do, we take a step further in this report, really laying out what are the specific impacts and relevance of forest on communities' resilience and how these are shaped by key factors. So we provide a large body of evidence on how forest dependence and proximity affects these relationships, how the existing socioeconomic systems in place also affect this relationship, and how other attributes take place. So to provide an example, forest-dependent communities, lifeways, are strongly dependent and connected with forests as they manage ecosystems and directly base their sustenance on fuelwood, timber, non-timber products, and other forest products and services. I believe Rachel will provide a bit more evidence on what are other social ecological attributes in place. And the third message is that with some bright spots, as mentioned by Craig, forest resilience is generally declining, and the combined effects of climate change and other disturbances pose critical threats to forest social and ecological systems. So we know that in many places, forests continue to face pressures. Craig already mentioned some examples. Where I work, for instance, in Chiapas, in Mexico, in the Selva Lacandona, growing demand for beef for both national and international markets is driving up deforestation in a tropical forest region. And also, as mentioned by Craig, we know that there are stressors that have increased as local, global, and tipping points are being approached. So this has to do with the planetary boundaries, as mentioned by Craig, and the triple planetary crisis that we're facing now. And what we know is that these threats are particularly pronounced for forest-dependent communities, and particularly across the tropics. And we have this image here. This is an image from the Global Forest Watch, very recently published a couple of weeks ago, showing how the extensive rate of forest fires in the last year, after we had written this report, but it's still relevant and showing the relevance of these stressors. So over to Rachel.
Thanks, Santiago. Next slide, thanks. So hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to sort of summarize on behalf of the many different contributing authors these key messages related to our resilience report. So key message 4 is around governance, really that governance, of course, is central in enhancing, it can enhance resilience through different sorts of mechanisms. It shapes and influences people-nature relationships through both formal and informal mechanisms, and also at nested scales. The report explores how perhaps certain forms of governance might be better suited to the delivery of resilience, but also to the delivery of justice, enhancing justice and equity outcomes. And potentially there are certain forms of governance which might lend themselves to do that best. For instance, adaptive governance is explored in the report and its various different attributes related to its flexibility, the possibility of learning, of feedbacks and of self-organization are all sort of positive in the context of thinking about governing for resilience. Transformative governance is another model which is explored there. And that chapter in our report also identifies different attributes related to governance and institutional arrangements that might be best suited for enhancing resilience. Next slide, please. But it also explores how, there's power dynamics that are really central to some of these issues, and of course also to governance arrangements that need to be considered. Because whilst resilience might have objective parameters and definitions that help to understand what state it is that we're defining as being resilient and what forms of resilience exist, there is also a more political and subjective dimension around what is the desired state, what do we want to govern for, whose voice is on the table in sort of deciding that, and what values are represented in that. And of course, those dynamics can be heavily influenced by power, uneven power relations, and vested interests, which can be at the detriment of forest resilience and forest contributions to social and economic resilience. We explore how there's a great deal to learn from forms of knowledge, of values, of governance arrangements of Indigenous peoples and local communities. There's increasing evidence showing how those arrangements actually have proven most consilient with forests and with forest resilience. And there on the right, you can see the work of Stephen Garnett and his co-authors, which map Indigenous lands overlaid with low-intensity anthromes and natural lands, and you can see the high level of overlap there. And yet those are also sites and contexts which are being increasingly marginalized and constantly attenuated. Next slide, please. So moving on to key message 5, this is really the point that no single forest-focused intervention is going to deliver resilience. In fact, what's going to be needed is bundles of interventions operating across scales and also across sectors. And so there are a broad range of response options already in existence to choose from, but no single one of those is likely to deliver. We do explore that potentially sort of fundamentally useful response options will be those that can tackle cross-cutting drivers of deforestation and degradation, for instance, and perhaps interventions around integrated fire management would be good places to start, because fire can pose a threat to many other response options operating in a given landscape, as well as securing rights as a sort of fundamental anchor for resilience enhancing response options. It's true too that all response options that we evaluate, of course, are operating within the broader context of the dominant development model, which, as Craig was outlining in the beginning, is also sort of leading to various forms of decline in resilience in the ecosystem services and in forests integrity. And there on the right, you can see, from economists through to ecologists, all arguing for some form of transformative change to that sort of dominant values model, which prioritizes material growth over other types of values, and which is leading to the demise of the natural environment and people-nature relationships within it. Next slide, please. So in the chapter on response options, hopefully we usefully identify these different attributes related to resilience enhancing response options. And so these provide almost a filter through which response options can be considered, in the sense of how are they likely to deliver to resilience? How do they deliver across these different attributes? And you can see in the chapter we explore a number of different response options for how they seem to deliver across these 10, and there's certainly a lot more that could be done. But hopefully this is a useful tool for policy and practitioners to use when thinking about what types of response options might be useful for enhancing resilience. Next slide, please. But also you've heard us talking about forests are interconnected landscapes, of course, connected to distant geographies, to the choices and behaviours of distant citizens. And so really we need response options that intervene at various different points along that sort of causal chain, and ideally operating in concert. So Next slide, please. We also lay out some different models and frameworks which are available to think about how to approach that challenge, one of which is connected conservation. You can see here the sort of graphical abstract of that, where on the left you've got the dominant drivers of decline, of deforestation, degradation, undermining resilience related to trade, climate change and one world development, coming from financial centres of wealth, all of which are dominant yet disrupting resilience. And so interventions could be targeted across these different levers, which you can see in the round, governance and accountability, economy and finance, etc., to disrupt and diminish the influence of those powerful but destabilizing drivers. Meanwhile, on the right, working with interventions and response options that can help to enhance and amplify the positive contributions from biocultural centres, which actually are consilient with nature, with resilient forests, and yet need a lot more support to help enhance and amplify those contributions across governance, diverse knowledges, and plural values. Next slide, please. And so also in that model, then, we think about and lay out what types of desired states might be sort of central to underlying those types of efforts, in which we lay out gratification, not growth, accountable trade and centres of wealth, meanwhile autonomy and rights, knowledge and value, diversity and biocultural centres. So that speaks also to the earlier point being made about resilience of what, for what, and by whom. Over to Craig. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Finally, we just like to wrap out in our review that we did recognize that there are knowledge gaps that we have that are fairly fundamental, or at least that we should work towards filling in, and these are they. We'd like to know what are the key drivers of resilience in forest, SES specifically. How can we quantify resilience in forests better? What are adaptive approaches that can both best serve forest, social ecological systems? How do we prioritize governance, management, and policy options? Which do we put to the forefront? How do we best communicate forest SES resilience benefits to lay people? And how do we equitably distribute benefits and burdens associated with forest SES? In the report, these research priorities are expanded upon with more specific questions, but we did want to at least put up that we recognize that there's a lot of unanswered questions still that should be focused upon. Thank you.
Thank you, the three of you, for these insights. And now we will watch recorded reflections on the assessments relevant for the Global Forest Agenda by Ximin Wu, Director of FAO's Forestry Division and the Chairperson of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to participate in the launch of the GFEP assessment, Forest as Pillars of Social and Economic Resilience, which FAO is pleased to support as chair of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests. Forests host up to 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, which enhances the adaptive capacity and resilience of people and ecosystems to climate change. Forests promote resilient agriculture through the ecosystem services they provide, such as water regulation, soil conservation, carbon sequestration, and habitat protection. They are a vital source of food and nutrition. Recent estimates indicate that up to 6 billion people regularly use non-timber forest products, including to support nutritious diets. Forests are natural pharmacies. Around 50,000 plant species, many of which grow in forests, have medicinal value. Healthy forests protect us from diseases. Forests have traditionally served as natural barriers to disease transmission between animals and humans. Forests boost our mental and physical health. Spending time in forests increases positive emotions and decreases stress, blood pressure, anxiety, and fatigue. Trees in cities absorb pollutants, which helps shield urban population from respiratory diseases. And forests provide jobs. An estimated 30 million people are employed in the forest sector worldwide. But forests are under threat, including from deforestation and forest degradation, the increased frequency and intensity of wildfires and pest outbreaks. They need our help, and it is essential, therefore, that the world recognizes their value. Released today, the World Environment Day, this new assessment by the Global Forest Expert Panel provides fresh insights into how forests contribute to building resilient societies and ecosystems. It emphasizes governance and policy interventions that can enhance the contribution of forests to social and economic resilience, such as integrated fire management, forest and landscape restoration, community-led adaptive forest management, and securing the right of indigenous peoples. Looking ahead to the COP30 climate conference in Brazil, where forests and the people who manage them will play a central role, we have an incredible opportunity to come together as a global community to promote the benefits that forests provide for all. We must make forests a focus of efforts to achieve better production, better nutrition, a better environment, and a better life, leaving no one behind. This report provides evidence to underpin our work. Thank you.
And after these words, we are very pleased to have with us today Gertrude Kenyangi, who will share her reflections on how the assessment findings resonate with realities on the ground. Gertrude is Executive Director of Support for Women in Agriculture and Environment, a grassroots NGO in Uganda. She is leading advocate for women's rights and community-based natural resource management and has led community-based forest ecosystem restoration efforts. In 2015, she was awarded the Wangari Maathai Forest Champions Award in recognition for her achievements in conserving forest biodiversity, combating desertification, and strengthening community resilience. Additionally, she is a member of different groups and constituencies related to the United Nations. If you have any questions for Gertrude, please make sure to share them in the Q&A box. Gertrude, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for having me. I first and foremost congratulate you on a very powerful assessment with strong evidence. It is very significant that a global assessment for current scientific evidence concerning the contribution of forests to social and economic resilience has been conducted. This is because the relationship between forests and people was indeed a major gap. This assessment is timely and, or one would say, it has been long overdue. I noticed that the scope of the assessment was global. That explains why the assessment did not tease out how the 5.8 billion people are dependent on the non-timber forest products. To make a distinction between the dependency on forests by communities in the global south and communities in the global north. because no one size fits all. When you look at chapter 3, relationships between forest and socio-economic resilience. While poverty has been consistently pointed at as a driver for deforestation and forest degradation, my experience has been that it's not the poverty of indigenous people, it is not the poverty of local communities, it's the poverty of the other commercially minded stakeholders who burn charcoal, who trade in timber. Poverty is relative. We might look at nations that are nations like China and see that they are prospering economically, but also the shortage of resources in their country point them at the global south, where they come to harvest the resources of the forest. I don't know how much you use the qualitative methods of research or assessment, for instance, one-on-one interviews. In a global assessment, I don't know how much you can use the qualitative methods, but they would have unearthed the forest governance in chapter 4. Attempts at good governance, such as participatory, transparent decision-making, and inclusivity, has been threatened by power imbalances between the stakeholders and rights holders. The rights holders being the indigenous peoples and local communities who lived or owned these forests before the Rio Convention. So free, prior, and informed consent looks good on paper. In practice, it does not exist because rights holders cannot match the financial or educational muscle of their stakeholders, pushing market-based mechanisms such as RED+. It's all cosmetic and superficial. And I'm talking from experience. I've been one of the implementers of a RED+ project. The indigenous peoples and local communities who are supposed to have free, prior, and informed consent, they are not present at meetings. They cannot afford to transport themselves to meetings. They do not comprehend the language in documents, which is usually English or one of the international languages, French or others. They cannot invoke the law in the case of being aggrieved. I mean, legal practices and legal services are very expensive. With their limited resources, it is impossible for them. So implementation of market mechanisms, such as RED, poses risks, social, environmental, and governance risks. It undermines the sovereignty of the indigenous people and local communities. And the imbalance in power, where power connotes force, legitimacy, or mandate. Usually, corporations have a lot more power. They have a lot more power with government and over communities. So there is a parallel system of government implementing laws and corporations driven by profit. Governments are conflicted to administer justice to their citizens concerning forests and other natural resources in the forest. Yet, they have to dance to the tune of corporations that are paying taxes. We've seen that happen very often. And finally, I wonder whether or not you will observe the principle of qualitative research and go back to the respondents and share the findings. It might be a tall order, considering that the scope of the assessment is global. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gertrude, for your words. And now we will start with the discussion, and we will try to address as many questions as possible. I encourage you to post your questions on the Q&A so we can pass them on to our speakers. And the first question, I will read it from here. The first question is, considering your study findings, what fundamental changes are needed to move from an extractive model to one that is truly community-centered and restorative? Who would like to take this question? Maybe Greg, do you want to start, and then if someone else wants to jump in?
We do. That's a tall order and a very fundamental change that's needed in part. The community-oriented part is a little more straightforward to attempt to implement than the change from extractive or capital-based systems. I think we cover that in part, that it's a difficult and tall order, but would be a fundamental transformative change in the way we well, not only in the way we manage forests, but manage our world, and would mean big changes that I think many of us would see as very beneficial, but a tall order. A smaller step is implementing community-based and adaptive approaches, and I think that's being done in many areas, and needs scientists from local areas all the way across the world, in the north and in the south, to work with local communities and indigenous groups and whomever the primary stakeholders in particular forests are, to work with them. And that's being done and implemented in many places, and it's being implemented via community-based management and adaptive management of natural resources. That in some places has worked quite well, and in other places is being implemented.
Thank you, Greg. Rachel, please go ahead.
Yes, well, first of all, I'd also like to thank Gertrude for her really brilliant set of points, I think, which sort of connects to this question also. And it's true that it's a very fundamental question, but a very challenging one also. And I don't think that, and in the report, certainly it's not clear that there's any single sort of answer to it necessarily, but rather a whole series of actions would likely be needed to sort of even incrementally shift towards that type of sort of transformation, if you like. But some of the things which come to mind are, I suppose, forms of governance which are more devolved and polycentric to distribute power and decision-making to also the more marginalized voices, but not just voices and actors, but also the values that they maybe represent. And I think considerations of different values in decision-making would also be a very important step towards a transformation, which then would allow for decisions to be made which accounted for other values. Because, and as you know, we touched on in the slides earlier, potentially one of the very significant drivers of decline of forests and their resilience relates to the dominance of particular value metrics and material values. But then value shifts especially are needed also in centres of wealth, right? And so to achieve that, there's likely to be many different types of interventions across education, law and policy to try to sort of set those seeds and move in that direction. And ultimately, there is no single sort of silver bullet, I don't think. One of the things that we do discuss in the chapter on response options, which is quite a nice model, is biocultural heritage models, which colleagues at IIED have been working with, sort of really trying to shift power dynamics, but also place different forms of value into decision making to manage those territories in a very sort of locally led way. But as Gertrude was also saying, you know, it's far more dominant drivers of decline that also need actions to try to shift their detrimental impacts on our forests.
Thank you, Rachel. Anyone wants to answer? Otherwise, we will jump to the next question. Yes, so the next question would be, can you provide examples of successful forest-based interventions that have enhanced social or economic resilience? And related to this, what would be the or some of the key factors for the success of these examples? Maybe Santiago?
Yeah, thanks. And I think I can try to connect this with the other question on community forests. So I think one example, like successful interventions in a place in a community setting, and I want to emphasize that this is a global report. So we have cases that are all over the place. Some very successful examples of community-based forest and natural resource management, others not so successful. What we try to do in the chapter 3 in relationships is to identify not only like the body of evidence, but also to try to create typologies of some conditions where they can be successful in the sense of they're contributing to social and economic systems, but also to forests. And we have this typology of win-win, win-lose, and so forth. I think one successful example, community-based management that comes to mind is in Oaxaca, indigenous communities who manage timber and who also engage, actually they engage in carbon offsets and other activities, but within a much broader understanding of how how forest management is and should be managed. So this has to do with timber extraction, engagement with markets, but in their own terms. So I think this comes back to the autonomy of communities to manage their land and their land systems, to make decisions, to make informed decisions within the community, to distribute benefits rather broadly within the community. And this allows them to exercise a certain degree of autonomy as to which policies and which instruments that are external they want to engage with. So this goes back to values in the end, to culture, and to these other things that we cover in like throughout the report.
Many thanks, Santiago. Anyone else wants to provide examples of cases? Otherwise, we continue with the next question. Next question will be...
Sorry, Nelson, I was just going to say that in the chapter, which is all on response options in the report, which you can now read, there's a whole series of response options that we consider there. And although it's true, of course, it's a global report. And so in some sense, we were not looking at how individual interventions have performed in particular sites, but rather trying to give a summary of how they could perform given their traits and their attributes. So there in the report, you can see a number of different interventions that we thought about, ranging from sort of land sharing, land sparing type interventions, demand side and legal interventions, certification schemes, just as some examples. And for a few, because it seemed so important to recognize how these interventions might play out in different contexts, for instance, between the North and the South, we explored that to some degree. So we did that for instance, the bioeconomy and circular economy response option type, because it seemed that the potential of particular response options really does vary quite dramatically across contexts. And I know that we have various different contributing authors and lead authors in the participant list who are very well placed to speak about some of those interventions in great detail as well. I'm not sure if they can take the mic, however, but if they are here.
Thank you, Rachel. And before I pass the word to Gertrude, I want to follow up on that and just to say that in the report, we also have several case studies in the boxes that exemplify the more academic text, that these are sometimes case studies of successful forest interventions that are contributing to social and economic resilience. So please read the report and you will find out a lot more. And Gertrude, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I have examples of successful forest interventions. For instance, I have witnessed the indigenous and local communities restore forests so that forests recover from degradation and deforestation when they participate. And then when they collaborate with the National Forest Authority, so that it's not just we don't go at global scale, we go at national, local, community scale. You know, we act locally to have global impact. And the key factors are participation, good governance, participation, transparency, inclusivity, bottom-up approaches, human rights-based approaches. The second factor is orienting interventions to the needs of the communities as incentives. You know, for instance, having teaming with the intervention for successful forest intervention should have a component of, for instance, nature-based, non-extractive enterprise. We team our interventions with like honey production so that people are incentivized. And then the third and last one is recognizing the power imbalances at different levels in the community, between men and women, for instance, that dictate the access to household productive resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gertrude. These were very good examples. The next question would be, how can we balance sustainable resource extraction with environmental protection? And this we could somehow reshape it a bit, instead of environmental protection, saying that how can we balance sustainable resource extraction with forests that can continue providing resilience for social and economic aspects. Who would be willing to take this question?
I think I could at least address that very briefly, in that I think that's rather key to sustainable benefits. We cannot have a forest that has compromised resilience and expect it to continue to provide the benefits that we've come to expect and rely on as humanity. A system that suddenly reorganizes or collapses or changes from forest to grassland in a what's viewed as a surprise often to humans certainly cannot continue to provide sustainable benefits to humans. So often we see resilience viewed, or at least in my view, as sort of a precautionary approach where it's possible to optimize benefits, extraction, if you will. But these optimal approaches rely upon expectation that conditions are ideal, and conditions are never ideal. And a resilience approach is rather different. A resilience approach attempts to guarantee production over time, but your production is going to be less optimal, if you will, but you will have production both in good times and bad times, if you will, because ideal conditions are never actually present, at least in my experience. Anybody else wish to expand?
If not, we can move on to the next question, which is, do you think forestry practitioners or communities are generally aware or concerned with the concept of resilience in their forest? So
I
it's a
can take
matter
that.
of, yeah. Go ahead.
I think the question, so maybe they would not use the concept of resilience directly, but they're certainly aware that changes are happening in their communities, practitioners as well, and they're finding ways to adapt, cope, buffer, and manage and transform with this change. So I think what we found is that the concept of resilience might sound like abstract in some ways. It's complex, but it's understood and used in different terms as well. And we found that as an example, when we were developing the framework, we found that there were different uses of the concept of resilience. There were bunch of different frameworks using resilience in different terms. We would try to identify it as kind of as an umbrella term that would allow us to say something relevant to do with how communities adapt, buffer, and transform against change. So they're certainly aware, and they're taking a bunch of activities to cope and buffer and transform against this change or with this change, even if they don't use that term particularly. And we have a bunch of examples of how they do this throughout the report.
Thank you, Santiago. Hopefully, after reading the report, they will start calling it resilience. Anyone else wants to expand on this question? Otherwise, oh, Rachel? You're muted, Rachel.
I could just add that it's quite fascinating, really, how there are these sort of quite different interpretations of resilience, including, recently I was in a workshop with a bunch of tropical ecologists who really think about resilience in one way, and then also grappling with this idea of, is resilience sort of maintaining the system, or is it about bouncing back, or is it sort of much more adaptive than that? And there are some really quite interesting things to think about when it comes to resilience. And I think for the resilience community also, a set of very particular sort of words and definitions, which might not necessarily be understood across all the different relevant stakeholders and rights holders. So I do think that's, and that's one of the research sort of frontiers or directions that we pointed out, which is how to best kind of communicate and maybe have a better common language, which is easier for many to understand, because there is quite a lot of particular terminology and jargon in the deep resilience literature that maybe is not accessible broadly.
Thank you, Rachel. Greg, anything to add from the resilience community?
No, nothing more.
Okay, then we go to the next question, which is, what can be done once tipping points have been crossed? And what is the role of forest restoration in all this? I see Greg nodding.
If I may, I mean, I think as our key message number one was, it is far simpler to maintain a system that's desirable, because systems that are undesirable can be highly resilient as well. That is, they're difficult to change. So if you cross a tipping point from a desirable forest system to a forest system that's undesirable, you have a problem. It is true. And it can be difficult to go back. And that's where transformation comes in. And transformation is that process of purposefully weakening or lessening the resilience of a system so that it can be then pushed back over that threshold and then restoring the original system. There are lots of problems with that process. It's risky. It's difficult to guide a systems reorganization. It's very risky to do so. You don't know what kind of key processes are really going to take hold and guide the system. But it's a process that's there, and we're learning more about it. And transformation is used in many different, like resilience is very many different meanings. But in the sense I'm talking about, we're talking about really changing the state of the system. Can you, if you cross the threshold and have a less desirable system, can you still work with that system? Yes, it depends what you've become. So what's on the other side of that threshold, if you will. Often, as I said, they're undesired. Sometimes you flip to a more desired system, or sometimes the change is from one forest type to another forest type that does not so much affect our relationship with the forest. So I hate to say this, but in many cases, it's very context dependent, depending upon what you've changed into. It's very context dependent upon the will to undergo a process such as transformation that can be difficult and risky. And it's very context dependent, depending upon what the change has been and how desirable or undesirable it really is. But it's once that threshold's passed, it's just much more difficult than maintaining a healthy, desirable resilient system in the first place.
Thank you, Greg. If anyone wants to expand on this. Otherwise, next question.
Well, I could just
yeah.
add that I think that's where how, in chapter 6, for example, the chapter on response options, there we introduce also these sort of attributes of resilience enhancing response options, and we connect to issues such as justice and equity, because in sort of determining whether a system state is desirable or undesirable, of course, there's also a social dimension to that. And so being able to evaluate and have plenty of representation in terms of what voices, what values are involved in the determination of what is the desirable state. We sort of highlight that as an important attribute for resilience enhancing response options, because that's where this element of subjectivity and a more normative kind of approach to resilience seems really relevant and important to include.
Thank you, Ray.
And I could just add on top of that, and I think it was mentioned once, I mean, a critical resilience question is resilience of what, to what, and for whom. The of what is resilience of forests, that's what we're talking about. And the to what is we've been talking about a wide range of disturbances, nothing specific really. But the for whom is a critical question. And what's a desirable system state for me may be very different from what's a desirable system state for you, and that varies by groups. And that's a very tough question, and where questions of inclusion and equity really come to forefront.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. The question is, what specific policy actions should governments prioritize to strengthen resilience? What would be some concrete first steps? Who wants to jump in? Rachel, maybe?
Well, I suppose sort of there are different scales that are relevant to the answer here, which is that both site level sort of interventions can contribute. For instance, forms of conservation which do have strong levels of equity and inclusion, devolved governance. So I'm not talking about sort of protected area type approaches necessarily, but far more integrated and sustainable use type interventions and strategies around rights recognition, recognising the territories of Indigenous peoples and local communities, for instance. I mean, those sorts of forest protection, but not from necessarily the protected areas viewpoint. And we do in the response options chapter reflect on the sort of some of the implications across strategies, looking at land sparing and land sharing, for example. But then so too is it important to, I think about how the actions of even those citizens outside of forest landscapes are, of course, living lives and livelihoods and making decisions around consumption and plenty of other things that are impacting forests. So it's not necessarily that, well, it certainly isn't that only site level interventions can deliver. I think Gertrude said earlier, you know, that local does have a role to play globally, but it's also the case that what's happening elsewhere in policies in distant geographies can impact what's happening in forest landscapes. So I think that it's important to keep that in mind too.
Thank you, Rachel. Craig?
I would simply add in a very broad sense that policy options that prioritize the resilience of social and economic systems in the forest themselves in a very broad sense. I don't think that's very often considered. We've touched upon the fact that other things drive world economies rather than the resilience of people and nature. And prioritizing the resilience of people and nature would be a very good start.
Thank you. Santiago?
Yeah, if I can just add more than specific policies, but we also identify some principles or what we call attributes or drivers of resilience. So, for instance, to do with institutions and governance, it has to do with diversity, connectivity, decentralization, autonomy, and so forth. So we provide several examples of how institutions that have these principles, attributes, whatever you call it, support communities. So in the end, policies that support these attributes and principles will support then communities and provide more resilience, social and economic systems for communities that will, through these feedback loops, also affect forests. So this is kind of sidelining the question of what policy options. It would be options that support these things that matter for communities and their resilience, no? And we have a bunch of examples on that.
Thank you, Santiago. And actually, we have 3 minutes still, so I can just pose the last question, which would be, how can we strengthen adaptive and transformative capacity? And if you have any practical examples of that. Rachel, I think.
I was going to suggest Craig.
Oh, okay.
Well, both of those properties of systems are about latent potential in the system that if we need them, need to be there. And those latent potentials lie in a lot of attributes of the systems, including one element that comes through time and time again as a critical component of resilience and adaptive capacity and transformative capacity is the diversity of the system, having multiple functions there that can come to play when need be. So maintaining diversity of systems in both speaking about biodiversity, but also human and cultural diversity is a critical attribute. Transformative capacity, well, and all these latent attributes are present at multiple scales in a system, whether we're talking about diversity, where we're talking about the diversity ranging from genetic diversity up to cultural diversity of humans. And that's a key attribute of resilience, is multi-scale nature of it. So really a lot of these maintaining adaptive and transformative capacity is really about maintaining the potential in the system to effect positive change when it's needed.
Thank you, Greg.
And maybe just to add, there's something perhaps also about, long-term planning and thinking and governance rather than short-term, because really only through that longevity of thinking about these systems over time is it sort of possible to have those adaptive capacity attributes, the sort of flexibility of those arrangements and the iterative forms of governance that might be needed. So I think that longevity is something that would be really useful, and that's one of the attributes also that we outline, which might be counter to some of the norms of managing and thinking about systems. For example, here in the UK, regenerative agriculture now is trying to sort of plan the management of that across much longer time horizons than have been the norm. So taking sort of 100 years into the future as part of the thinking. And maybe that sort of those longer time spans are really important for the governance and for thinking about resource management in a resilient SES.
Thank you. And with this, we will have to close our discussion. I want to thank you all for your answers, but also thank you to the audience for their good questions. And we sadly are running out of time, so we have to come to a close. And I just want to mention that if you want to learn more about the assessment and the accompanying policy brief, you can scan the QR code you see now on your screens, and you can freely download both publications. And just to stress that what we have heard today confirms the importance of forests for social and economic resilience in the face of disturbance and change. And we have also learned about what can and need to do, what we can and need to do to support and steward resilient forest systems. And by focusing on the dynamic interlinkages between forest, people, and policy, this assessment provides a knowledge base for decision makers, practitioners, and researchers seeking to understand and strengthen just forest-based pathways to resilience. We sincerely hope that this publication will support a more coherent policy dialogue and to provide useful insights. And finally, I wish to express my sincere gratitude to all speakers in this event and to all authors and reviewers of the publication. I also want to thank the CPF and its member organizations, and especially also a big thank you to our donors, without whom none of this work would have been possible. And I want to thank each one of you in the audience for joining this event. Just a reminder that the recording of this session will be available on IUFRO's YouTube channel shortly. I wish you all a good day, a good evening, or a good night, depending on where you are. Thank you.